She had a habit of carrying two lives in the crook of her arms, the bobbing, stubborn weight of Kevin and the quiet, contemplative weight of Jane. That night, when the rain turned the city into a smear of reflected headlights and neon, Claire kept one hand on the stroller and the other on a promise she had been whispering to herself for years. Thin, electric vows about keeping them fed, keeping them safe, keeping the world from naming them mistakes. She didn't plan to be a hero. She planned to get home, peel off her damp coat, warm the milk, and sketch until the children fell asleep. Her designs paid the rent, barely, her reputation did not. In the industry, a name could be a passport or a noose. Claire kept her sketches small and sharp, her mouth shut about her past, and her hopes folded neatly into the lining of a second-hand coat. The crash happened 3 blocks from the diner where she'd stopped for coffee. A sedan had clipped a lamppost and rolled like a wounded animal, glass flashing in a series of small, cruel explosions. When she ran toward the sound, she found a man half out of the driver's seat, his face pale under a curtain of rain, his breath making shallow, urgent noises. Blood slicked the seat and trailed like a question into the puddles. He was large enough that Claire felt, for a fraction of a second, like a mouse standing beside a fallen oak. Then she saw the angle of his jaw, the way one hand clutched his side. She moved because there was no one else to move. The stroller waited obediently at the curb, Kevin and Jane asleep, oblivious to the world. She told them, once, as if to herself, that whatever she did tonight would not be for glory. It would be for oatmeal and shoes and the quiet knowledge that they would wake to another day. When she leaned in, his eyes fluttered open, gray, disoriented, and frighteningly ordinary. He looked like a man who had been carved out of marble, and then, in the next breath, made painfully vulnerable. "Please," he said, in a voice that tried to mask the panic. "Don't." "Okay," Claire said. She had one scarf, one phone, 2 hands that knew how to tie knots and how to mend seams. She ripped the scarf in 2, folded it into a tourniquet as best she could, pressed hard against the wound. People gathered. One shouted for an ambulance, another held an umbrella over them. A stranger offered a jacket. The world, for a small, fierce span, narrowed to her palms and the sound of his breath. He squeezed her fingers as if to apologize, and then, with a humorless laugh, tried to move. The movement made him gray at the edge of his lips. Claire kept compressing. The ambulance arrived, voices rising and falling in a language of urgent professional calm. Paramedics took over. One of them pulled Claire back gently, offering her a blanket. Another scribbled into a tablet. She refused the blanket at first, as if standing there would keep him from thinking she had been courageous. When the flashes of police lights painted the puddles in blue, she finally allowed herself to step away. That night, the newspapers would later call it a mugging. The tabloids called it a gashed windscreen, a night on a private road, a billionaire cut down in the shadow of the city. To Claire it was a man breathing shallowly because she had held the place where he bled. She learned his name in the ambulance bay when a doctor, seeing her still trembling hands, asked if she knew who he was. "Torres," he said. "Sean Torres, Torres Group, CEO." The word landed like an added weight. Money didn't change blood. It didn't change the fact that a small red stain on torn denim could be fixed by the same improvised skill she used to sew a missing button back onto a dress. When Sean's assistant, young, efficient, startled, offered her a card and a thank you that trembled between gratitude and bewilderment, Claire snatched it, barely hearing the platitudes. She left before the press did, the rain turning her hair into a dark outline around her shoulders. The city blurred. Her children slept in a borrowed neighbor's living room because she had no one to call, and she had to get them home. She called in sick the next morning and wrapped Kevin and Jane in extra sweaters. Their cheeks were still flushed from the fever of sleep. Kevin, forever nosy, peered at her hand and asked the thing children ask with blunt honesty. "Did you save a hero, Mama?" She smiled like a coin with both sides shining. "I did," she said. "We saved somebody." At noon, when the sky had cleared into a sharp, hard blue, there was a knock at her door. Claire, who had memorized the way the city moved, her corner grocer, the bus times, the name of the woman who kept watch over lost umbrellas, stared through the peephole and saw an expensive silhouette, a broad jacket, polished shoes, the kind of confidence that arrives as light and erases the need for a map. She opened the door to find a man standing there with the stiffness of someone trying to measure out gratitude with the wrong tools. "Claire Avery?" he asked, as if asking for her name would be enough to turn the world right side up. "Yes," she answered. The name on the card she had kept felt heavier now. "You—" "Sean Torres," he said, offering a hand that was both apology and proposition. Up close, he looked smaller than the figure the tabloids painted. The wound at his side was bandaged. His coat bore a faint smudge of brown that could be mistaken for mud or memory. He stood there in her doorway, rain having given way to sun, an unconsciously cinematic silhouette against a worn hallway. "I don't want favors that smell like obligations," he said abruptly. "You saved my life. I won't let it be a balance sheet. I want to offer you—" His eyes flicked past her, to the stroller where Jane stirred and Kevin watched with the blunt focus of a child watching a magician. "Security. A job. Something that gets you off the edge." Claire's first instinct was to refuse. The world taught her to refuse handed-out kudos that arrived like charity. The city had taught her to be proud of the small, honest gains. But there was that look in his eyes that wasn't about his empire. It was the look of a man who had been shocked into a kind of moral clarity. "Please," he said, almost pleading. "Give me a day. Let me fix the things that being a billionaire should have fixed before now. Let me offer you an option." "An option," Claire echoed, tasting the word. It sounded like a seedling in a long, dry drum of a life. He did not kneel, as if to thank her. He did something messier and truer. He took out a small box from inside his coat, a jewelry box, simple and absurd when dropped into the worn frame of her hallway, and opened it. Inside, the thing gleamed. Not a ring meant to compress a life into a symbol, but a token of something that had both public and private sides. A watch. It wasn't a showy display. It was a thing he obviously wore, worn at the corner, scratched like a life lived. "I don't know you," he said, "but I know what it is to owe someone. I'm offering to be where I'm needed." The watch was a gesture, an anchor. Across the street, a bus hissed. Kevin asked, with the brutal honesty of children, "Is he our dad?" He had noticed the tilt of Sean's jaw, the same stubborn line on his father's face in a photograph Claire kept folded in a box. Claire's heart banged like a fist against the ribs of a caged animal. She looked at Sean, who didn't answer the child's question. Instead, he knelt to be at their level, eyes steady. "I don't know if I'm your father," he said. His voice didn't promise paternity tests and DNA and legal forms. It promised a presence that rewired so many futures. "But I want to be near the answer. Let me help. Let me stand between you and whatever tries to take the world from you." It was a proposal that carried the weight of both rescue and contract. No one spoke the word marriage. He didn't have to. He spoke in offers that formed a halo around the word: protection, employment, a place inside the company, support. The city seemed to hold its breath. Claire saw cameras flash in her mind before they happened, rumors that would turn noble gestures into headlines. She saw the children pulled into a microscope. She thought of the neighbor's son who had once told her that if you allowed one stranger into your home, you invited 100 other strangers to judge your choices. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you were the only one who didn't look to profit from the moment," he said, and the sentence landed with an honesty that was almost dangerous. "Because you were the one who put your hands on me and treated me like a man, not like a title. Because I think you deserve a room in a building where your talent isn't dismissed before it's seen." He left her with his card, with the watch's imprint on her palm, with a knock on the fragile shell of her resolve. Newspapers the next day would print a different version, an impulsive billionaire swept by romance. But in Claire's kitchen, with a pot on the stove and 2 sleeping children, it felt like a ledger being rebalanced. She accepted the offer the way someone accepts shelter in a storm. "If you want to see how one night can change everything, stay with me for this," she said, almost breathless, more to the empty air than to anyone. It felt like saying grace before a meal she didn't know how to cook. Weeks later, the decision would be called reckless by magazine editors and compassionate by human resources. For now, it was a choice that reverberated like the first pluck of a harp string. Claire accepted the job on a probationary basis, a junior designer on a high-stakes internal initiative at Torres Group called Phoenix Rising. a name that smelled like a promise and a press release. It was to be a showcase of new talent, a pivot away from the sometimes stodgy silhouettes of the brand and towards something more human, more daring. Her appointment, part protection, part artistic placement, put her directly under the gaze of Luna Barrington. Luna was all the things Claire was not permitted to be, born into privilege, glossy, a smile honed by PR teams and teeth whitening. She was also the woman Sean's board had expected him to marry. Their engagement had been in the papers on polite pages for months. When Luna arrived at Taurus Group, she brought with her a scent of gardenias and friction, an instinctive sense of ownership over stages and space. Her mother was a presence behind a presence, calling shots with the subtlety of a woman who had taught her daughter how power looks when it is not asked for but assumed. Claire's first walk through Torres Group was a kaleidoscope of clean lines, whispers, and the muted clicks of heels. She carried a portfolio of sketches, her courage folded into each page like a stitch. Designers nodded with the wary politeness that comes when a new name opens the possibility of competition or collaboration. There were elevators with mirrors that made her feel smaller, and offices that hummed like a hive. Ethan, Sean's younger brother, offered a smile that was part friendly, part assessment. He was casual in a way that suggested he could be dangerous in his indifference. "You're the one he saved," someone said, as if that fact could be a biography or a destiny. It became a label pinned to Claire like a name badge she never asked for. The Phoenix Rising brief was exacting. The board wanted risk with polish, rebellion with fabric that could be produced, a line that could be translated from runway poetry into wearable reality. Claire threw herself into the work as she always had. She pulled fabrics across her knees, layered textures like a composer layering notes, drafted seams that hummed with possibility. For a couple of weeks, it felt like the center of the storm had moved away from her. People praised her sketches in the quiet back rooms. Interns whispered that she had the old-school eye combined with a modern cut. Sean would glance in during critiques, his presence a steady, watchful tide rather than a tidal wave. He was careful to keep the terms of his proposal private, protection, not patronage. Then things began to snap. At first it was small, almost dismissible. A page missing from a portfolio, a fabric swatch found torn out beneath a drafting table, a pattern uploaded to the shared server with someone else's name attached. Claire learned to breathe through indignity. She had learned how to keep the world from seeing the earthquake under her feet. Luna's smile, when their paths crossed, carved. "We can't have the brand splinter under amateur hands," she said in the cafeteria, voice silk over steel. "There are standards here. We can't let sentimentality dictate taste." The accusation of plagiarism arrived in an email the way a public guillotine might, swiftly, with a blade that had been polished. A well-placed intern had found a dormant design in the archive that had similarities with Claire's Phoenix Rising draft. Someone claimed lineage, someone else amplified it. By the time Claire raced into the studio, drafts were arranged in a line like evidence. Luna's circle watched with that particular kind of enjoyment that looked like entitlement. "Explain," Luna said, eyes puppeteered by a smile. "How did your sketch arrive on our server under a different name?" Claire swallowed. She could have screamed about the copyist who had used her sketches to market their own line, about the habit of junior designers to borrow what they couldn't create. But the room had cameras and ears, and the kind of politics that devoured good temper for breakfast. "I didn't file it under anyone's name," Claire said. "I kept my drafts. I have the originals." "Show us," Luna said, confidence sharpened into a blade. The gallery of accusations had an audience of half-believers and rumor merchants. Claire produced her notebook, smudged, precious, the corners worn from being tucked into pockets. She turned the pages with the calm of someone who had rehearsed nothing and trusted everything. The lines were hers, not just in concept, but in detail. Annotations in her looping hand, the tiny corrections that proved iterative thought, the stains of coffee that only belonged to nights spent in solitary pursuit. A senior designer nodded. An assistant made instant copies. But someone had more cunning than embarrassment. The archived file had a timestamp that predated Claire's sketches. The server logs could be manipulated. Digital signatures could be forged by a hand with access. What was at stake wasn't merely credit. It was a career squeezed down to a single public image. Claire felt the room tilt. She saw Ethan's jaw set like a hinge. Sean's face said nothing. He watched her with an intensity that was both fault-finding and impossibly protective. "Probation will be enforced," the head of design said, voice bureaucratic and merciless. "Until this is resolved, we need to be sure there's no breach in procedure." Claire left the room with her portfolio hugged to her chest, a child clutching a doll. She did not cry in the hallway. She let herself think of the stove at home, of the two small heads that would climb into her lap that evening, of having to explain why someone else had decided she was unreliable. She marked the moment as one of those fractures that could either break her or reveal a new kind of leaning. Rumors in the city are like moths. They are harmless until they eat through fabric. The whisper that followed, something about the twins' likeness to Sean, arrived in a way that had been orbiting Claire's life since Kevin and Jane were born. Children notice features, strangers notice the wrongness of resemblance. Kevin's ears were stubbornly similar to photos she had seen of Sean's family at a charity gala. Jane had the same little fold at the corner of her left eye that appeared in a portrait of Sean's father. People began to notice and to gossip. At first it was a quiet speculation at rooftop parties. "Do you think?" Then it became press-friendly. "Is there a hidden story here?" Social feeds lapped at the rumors like obedient dogs. Claire refused to be baited. She kept her head down. When a whisper became a pinned article asking about paternity, she felt the floor move beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with design drafts. Sean, to his credit, refused to answer in public. He issued nothing, posted nothing. But privately, he hovered like a storm that could break either way. His absence of denial was both shield and blade. "I can handle it," she told him once in his office, which smelled faintly of lemon and old money. "I didn't ask for this, but if it's about me, I'll fight." "Then don't fight alone," he said. He did not tell her his reasons, but he put up practical defenses. Private counsel, a discreet investigator to ensure no sample mishandling could pin the twins to falsehoods. His team set up a chain of custody for Claire's personal records, birth certificates, hospital paperwork, anything that could be exploited. He insisted the children have no part in public statements. He moved within known legal parameters without turning her life into a headline. Ethan's lean against a studio pillar that afternoon could have been read as sympathy. He offered to help Claire navigate the internal politics. "This place eats people like you alive," he said with a half-smile that acknowledged both their discontent. "You won't be the first to get chewed up." What Claire didn't know was that Luna's mother had been watching not from the boards but behind curtains, making calculated decisions. She was a woman who understood that fear could be manufactured and that the city would swallow any scandal if it had a pleasing shape. She placed small, dangerous things into motion. A misplaced sample here, an anonymous tip there. Each act was a feather added to the scale. In the evenings, the twins asked questions that were more precise each day. They had started to notice the way people looked at them in restaurants, the way an empty seat at a table could be a statement. Kevin asked outright, "If he likes our drawings, does that mean he likes us more?" Claire answered with the only honesty she had. "He likes what he sees," she said. "But people like us for different reasons. The important thing is who we are when we're alone." The city hummed, and the Phoenix Rising project hummed louder. Fabric, runway models, a mountain of logistics that turned creative sparks into deliverables. Claire moved between fittings and late-night revisions. Her designs began to get attention, small, hungry, delighted attention. She cut a coat that leaned towards something unclassifiable and brilliant. A junior model tried it on and stepped into an office and set a senior editor's mouth to water. Suddenly, what had been whispered as theft could be reframed as talent. But for every person who nodded in approval, two more asked pointed questions about whether a designer so recently pulled out of the cold could be trusted. Then the threats started. At first it was an unsigned envelope with a smear of mud and a card that said, in slick lettering, "Stay out of what belongs to others." Claire burned the card in the sink because doing anything else felt like telling the world that she had been moved by fear. Sean, when he heard, appeared with the quiet of someone who had been to battle and found it childish. "I'm increasing security," he said. "Not for my ego, for your kids." "That's not why he did it," the neighbor said when Claire confided the incident to a friend. "He did it because he could." Claire held onto that accusation like a rope. She refused to let it define the terms of her acceptance. She kept drafting, kept sewing, and kept loving two small children whose dreams were drawn in crayon and sleeping between the pages of her pattern books. One night, a car she had parked in the alley had its passenger window smashed in. Nothing taken, except a small case of mood and composure. Claire's hands shook as she swept the glass away, while Kevin and Jane watched cartoons in the living room, safe in their cocoon of cushions. When she reported it, security found a faint smear across the dashboard. A fingerprint that did not belong to anyone on the staff roster. Sean's presence grew more deliberate. He did not hover, which would have suffocated. He placed himself in the perimeter. His team ran background checks on interns, audited server access, and tightened the chain of custody for designs. He also offered practical aid, a place for the twins to stay when he sensed she needed a break, a driver to get her to fittings. His proposal, the next-day promise of protection and work, was settling into the shape of something real. His empire offered a platform and a shield. Claire did not know, in those quiet interludes between fittings and whispers, that the mother of Luna was drawing maps. She didn't know that the accusations were seeded with care, that when a file went missing or a server timestamp appeared questionable, it was because a woman in another part of the city had paid someone to bend the law of accidental leaks. Claire only felt the slow accumulation of small injuries, a reputation nicked, a safe place breached. Then, one afternoon when the sky was the leaden color of things before a reckoning, Claire received a call. Her voice on the other end was breathless, the kind of voice that used to belong to a neighborhood mother in stories, and now belonged to a director who had decided to play truth like a card trick. "We need you in 5 minutes," the director said. "There's been an incident with the Phoenix samples. Someone claims your line is a replication. We need to sort it out before the press hears." Claire's ribs clenched like the stitching in a hem. She ran. On the way to the studio, she pictured the twins, their small faces turned to her like maps. She imagined headlines that would ask the city its ugliest questions. She imagined Luna's mother smiling across the table at a cafe, slow and sure. And when she arrived, the room hummed with tension. Her portfolio sat under a glass dome, as if on trial. A senior director unrolled the alleged original with an air of revelation. "This carries your hand, doesn't it?" he asked. Claire recognized the patterns. They were not copies, but a common language. She recognized pixels and seams and the quiet artistry of someone who knew her industry. Then she saw the footage of an office camera. There, at 3 a.m, a figure in a hood moving through the hallways, a flash of a hand. It was quick, grainy, but the silhouette could have been anyone. The footage was used like a mirror. It reflected guilt if you stood too close. Who else had access to the drafting room? She asked. The question needed more than answers. It needed witnesses. "Anyone could have," said a junior assistant, voice creaky, "especially after hours." The accusation would have teeth if no one bit back. Claire felt a surge of something akin to cold fury. It was never enough to look like you had integrity. You had to be armed against people who were willing to make you look like a lie. Outside, the city moved on because cities always did. Inside that room, small humane things were collapsing into machinery. Claire's cheap coat felt spent in her hands. She wanted to run home and cradle her children until all the alarms went silent. But she couldn't. She had 2 lives she carried at once, and both needed a woman who could withstand a storm. She prepared for the worst. She organized her records. She demanded an audit. She asked for the server logs. She fought like someone who'd sewn her own hem and knew exactly where the stitch could be picked. And yet, in the quiet between battles, there was Sean. He watched her from the perimeter, silent, steady, sometimes inscrutable. Once, in the late hours when the studio lights went down, he appeared with coffee and a blanket, as if gratitude could be traded for shared warmth. "You don't have to prove yourself to me," he said, and it was both a comfort and a constraint. "Prove it to yourself. Prove it to your kids. Let me handle the rest." Claire's smile was small. She took the coffee with both hands. In the dark, between the sketches and the sound of rain on the window, his watch glinted against the desk like a promise. The story was far from over. The city was full of hands, some offering help and some ready to take. A campaign of whispers was beginning to slither like oil under a door. Claire tightened her grip around what mattered, ink-stained fingers, the feel of fabric beneath her palms, the steady breath of 2 sleeping children. She would not squander what she had stitched together alone. What she could not know then, what no one in those early days could see, was the way small actions would start to chain into something larger. An accusation flung into the teeth of a company rumor mill. A smear that arrived at the precise hour that a fashion editor flipped a page and decided a controversy was more newsworthy than art. Handshakes that hid knives. A mother in a suburban living room tracing each step of a plan like the pattern of a dress, each piece placed with a surgeon's precision. The night she returned from a meeting where she had been hounded and patronized in equal measure, the whole way to her apartment smelled faintly of bleach. The door to the communal laundry had been left open. Her stomach fell. Within minutes she found a note under her front door, slick with some dried glue that clung to the floor. It was short and precise. "Keep out. For your children's sake, step away." She recognized the script as one of those shapes people used when they wanted to make a threat look casual. For the first time since she had wrapped Kevin in her sweater and whispered about oatmeal and shoes, Claire felt fear that wasn't a 6-layered armor, but a plain human tremor down her arms. She picked up the note like you pick up something fragile and dangerous. She called Sean. He arrived within the hour, presence concise and unflustered, accompanied by a security team that moved through her small apartment with practiced care. He crouched to the twins with a softness that surprised her. His fingers were gentle, almost incredulous in their tenderness. "We're going to find who did this," he said, "and they'll answer for it." Claire wanted to say something decisive, a line that would make the world right. Instead, she wrapped an arm around her children and let the kind of silence fall that was not empty, but loaded with all the things that had so far been asked of her. She thought of the watch in her drawer and the card he had left at her door. He had offered her protection as a currency, and she had, pragmatically, accepted. Outside, the city remained incandescent, uncaring, endless. Inside, in her small living room, the wheels had started to turn. The phoenix was not yet rising. There were more embers to feed, more hands to bind. There would be questions about parentage and ownership, about why a woman like Luna would press her mother into action, about whether a man with the world at his feet could change the shape of it for the people he cared for. Claire sat on the couch with the two of them leaning into her like they were shells against a rock. She placed the note between her fingers and folded it away. It would be evidence, it would be proof. And then she drew a breath, the kind that sews courage to bone. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something messy and sharp and necessary. She had saved a life once. The world had changed in the echo of that one pulse. Now someone had offered her a place inside a machine that could either crush or carry her. The decision she had made at the door that morning, accepting Sean's offer, had been a hinge. Whether it would swing open into refuge or trap would depend on what they all did next. Above the city, lights flickered like watchful stars. Below, in the quiet of her small apartment, Claire found her fingers going to her sketchbook as if to reassure herself that she still knew the work of making. She would not go quietly. She would not let fear be the editor of her life. She would design and she would defend. The world had offered her a scaled-up life with public scrutiny built into every seam. She had accepted. Now she would learn how to stitch armor that fit like a dress. And somewhere in the glass towers of Torres Group, Luna's mother tightened her glove and smiled at the beginning of a plan that would, she hoped, unmake the unwanted thread. The note under her door was a thin, deliberate cut into the quiet she tried to build around the twins. Luna's mother had arranged for whispers to rattle like loose change. Now the whispers had edges. Claire folded the paper into the pocket of her coat and walked to the studio with a careful, measured pace. She had learned to make seams that bore weight without tearing. Now she would stitch her life back together with the same hands. The next days were an assembly of small surgical moves. Sean's team installed discreet cameras and tightened access to the drafting rooms. He arranged a private meeting with the head of security, who promised an audit of server permissions and a scan for any ghost accounts that might have planted files. Claire handed over original sketches, notes, fabric swatches stained with the ink of late nights, everything that traced her process. They photographed pages, time-stamped them, and loaded copies into secure drives that sat like anchors in the company vault. All of this was lawful, slow, precise, and boring to a city hungry for scandal. If someone wanted spectacle, Sean gave them procedure. If someone wanted proof, Claire gave them work that could not be misread, layers of drafts, corrections, and coffee stains that only the maker would know how to place. But the opposition understood spectacle intimately. Luna and her mother knew how to turn oxygen into fire. Their attacks became more targeted. A private label that Claire had been developing suddenly appeared in a boutique sample room under another designer's name. An email began to circulate with doctored images that put Claire's sketches against archived designs in a way that looked suspiciously deliberate. There was a tone of practiced cruelty to their hits, someone who knew the architecture of rumor and where to pry open a seam. The paternity rumors, which had been a simmering discomfort, were fanned like tinder. A gossip piece, thin on facts, heavy on insinuation, printed a side-by-side of the twins and a family photo of Sean, labeling it Questions. A commenter suggested a chain of custody issue and asked lazily why Claire hadn't produced hospital receipts months ago. The article asked, subtly, whether Claire had taken advantage of Sean's night of vulnerability for her own ends. Sean stopped the leaks he could, with legal letters and a stern calm that quieted certain contributors. But he could not shut the human habit of speculation. People wanted a story with a scandal-shaped core, and the resemblance of small faces to a public figure was the shape they sought. Claire felt the weight of it differently than she had feared. The rumor was not only about identity, it was about the quiet dignity of her children. She found herself scanning every small interaction, instructing Kevin not to wave at strangers, and telling Jane to stay close in crowds. She learned the terrain of polite suspicion, a smile that lingered, a look that catalogued similarities, a whisper that made a breakfast table feel like a grading panel. It was during one of those long nights that the investigator Sean had hired called with a name, Javier Cruz, a lab technician who had worked on private samples for boutique clinics. Javier's online trail was thin, the kind of existence people make when they work in the parts of the city that do not show on glossy pages. He had been seen leaving the clinic at odd hours with a small envelope. A receipt traced back to a courier service had a delivery to the building where Luna's mother kept a private office. The pieces did not make a mosaic yet. They made a suspicion. The investigator suggested a trip. Claire protested. She had sketches to finish and twins to tuck in. But she also had a fear that if she did not follow, the rumor would turn into a weapon against her kids. Sean seemed to understand the cost of a mother's resolve. He insisted she go and offered to accompany her. She declined. She wanted to do it on her own terms. She would not let anyone write her as someone who needed a bodyguard at every corner. She took the train to the suburban clinic with a portfolio and a patient shaped by necessity. Javier was not hard to find in the end. He was hard to scare, the sort of man who had learned to be prosaic about being paid to be careless. He admitted, without much drama, that he had been paid to handle a sample in a way that would allow the creation of a false positive. He avoided saying who had hired him, until Claire, with a steady voice, mentioned a name that lived in the tabloids with a scent of because she could. He flinched. The story unraveled. A front account, a transfer wired from an intermediary, a hand that had known how to find the right slot in the system. Claire left the clinic with the legal preliminary report and a new ache in her chest. Someone had tried to weaponize her children's blood. She called Sean. He came immediately, taking the train to pick up the twins and bringing a calm that felt like a shield. He watched the way the children reached for her hand and how she answered every question with the slow certainty of someone meeting a storm with a ladder. "We'll compile this," he said. "We'll take it to council, but there will be leaks and weeks of procedure. We need a way to, if not stop the rumors, then to defang them." Claire thought of the Phoenix Rising runway and how a dress could be both proof and poetry. She suggested a strategy that surprised even herself. Use the public reveal as a place to put the truth on the pedestal where rumor could be unmasked. Instead of cowering from spectacle, they would use it to show work, chain of custody, and the digital footprints that proved Claire's authorship. It would be risky. Luna would expect confrontation, and Luna's mother would likely attempt a final invested strike. But there was power in visibility, in allowing the right kind of light to do its work. In the weeks before the gala, sabotage escalated into intimidation. One night, someone smashed the window of Sean's car that Claire had borrowed for a delivery. The glass lay like confetti across the seat. Another time, a wardrobe box with an important prototype went missing from a transit dock and turned up days later with a seam cut in a way that suggested sabotage. The company offered a secure vehicle for deliveries and insisted Claire not travel alone to certain fittings. Then came the first kidnapping attempt. It happened with the clumsy, brutal simplicity of a plan grown mean. Kevin and Jane were at a playgroup supervised by a neighbor Claire trusted. The neighbor, Marta, had been a chronic helper. She watched the twins while Claire attended critiques or late fittings. That morning, Marta called Claire in a voice that had a cracking edge. "They asked me to forget," Marta said. "Two men at the gate, they said they'd take the kids to meet their aunt. They were official seeming, but they weren't from any agency I know." Claire's throat closed. She dropped everything, telling Sean in clipped words where to go. He moved like a man who had found a map but not all the coordinates. Security intercepted the car near a closed-access road and found an empty child seat and a note meant to terrify. "You shouldn't have stitched yourself into our world." The message was smaller than the danger, but enough to splinter the night into fear. Sean's response was decisive. He ordered increased protection around the kids, set up a secure schedule for pickups, and personally accompanied Marta to file a report. Claire wanted to be furious. Instead, she felt the odd weight of relief and the rust of anger. She had saved a life once, and now someone had tried to steal the lives she held most dear. The attempt had missed, but its closeness shifted something between them, between Claire and the company, between her and Sean. The perimeter around her life had been redrawn, but the antagonists did not end with failed kidnappers. They escalated in a new direction, legal pressure and material sabotage that left traces. Luna's mother, cornered and skilled with the language of social ruin, switched tactics. Instead of a headline that could be traced to a single accusation, she paid for a forensic short-circuit, a staged leak of a relationship formed to mask paternity questions with romantic motive. She arranged for an anonymous tipster to claim Claire had used her proximity to Sean to travel from anonymity to opportunity. The PR world, always greedy for patterns, built narratives out of coincidence. Sean stood with Claire in the hours they were most alone, in his office with the skyline of the city spreading like a map of decisions. He did not promise instant fixes. He was not a man of fantasy. He promised action and a procedural patience that was, frustratingly, sometimes the only thing that worked. "We'll clear the record," he said. "But the way to do that is slow and boring and precise. The world loves the loud resolution, but we both know which one holds." Claire wanted faster resolution. She wanted the rumor confronted with a microscope and the people responsible named and shamed, but she also had the sense that untempered outrage might give Luna the satisfaction of spectacle. So she worked with Sean and his team to gather everything. Nurse logs from the hospital where the twins were born, the courier receipts, the cell tower pings for the courier who handled the sample, the security footage from the building where Luna's mother kept her office. It was an inventory of small truths. All along, the studio worked. Phoenix Rising had grown from a single sketch into a line that suggested an evolution for Tora's group. Garments that could breathe and move, and crucially, tell stories about people like Claire. She shepherded fittings, adjusted seams with a surgeon's hand, and spent long nights in a drafting room turned confessional. Her designs began to gain quiet accolades. A fashion editor praised a coat in a whispered note. A buyer requested a sampling. The work spoke in a language that rumors could not easily translate into accusation. Ethan stayed near the edges of these events with a complicated, deferred tenderness. He flirted in the way of someone who liked the chase and admired Claire's stubbornness. At times, his behavior calmed her. He was an unexpected ally in office politics. At others, it made her wary. His relationship to the Torres family was a knot that had both warmth and potential to tangle. He was not the architect of Luna's plans, but he was a variable. His presence provoked jealousy in Luna and scrutiny in the boardroom. The night before the Golden Feather Awards, the design house held a private press rehearsal in the main hall. Models walked in muted light, and Claire watched garments move like promises. Luna moved through the crowd as if crowned. Her mother sat in the shadows, a smile that read like calculation. "Tonight will either break you or make you," Luna said, with a closeness Claire did not welcome. Claire had learned to answer with work. "If you are betting on me breaking, bring better odds," she replied, voice steady. Luna's lips curved without humor. The awards night arrived with a kind of thunder. The ballroom glittered with cameras, metal and velvet. Reporters leaned against backstage rails, their phones bright like swallows. The Phoenix Rising segment was scheduled for later in the evening, a closing cadence that would ensure attention. For the first time since she had accepted Sean's offer, Claire felt the odd sensation that her life could pivot on a single walk. Backstage, she breathed slow. The twins were safe with a vetted nanny at a quiet suite Sean had arranged. He had insisted they not be present, too much exposure, and Claire acquiesced, more anxious for them than for herself. She pinned fabrics into place, felt the textures against her fingertips, and took the small solace of craft. There was a hum of music, and the scent of perfume and the low murmur of voices testing applause. Then the moment arrived that everyone had been waiting for, the Phoenix Rising show. The house lights dimmed, and the first model moved like a wave. Claire watched her work come to life. Seams that held breath, coats that claimed movement, collars that stood up like small declarations. Cameras flashed. The audience stirred. Her heart moved in time with the cadence of steps across the runway. At the climax of the show, when the lead piece glided down as if pulled by an invisible current, a shout came from the back of the room. Someone had climbed into the aisle, a woman with a microphone and a thin voice that carried like a strike. "We have an objection," she said, and in seconds the room turned toward the disruption like a nervous thing. It was Luna's mother, standing in a dress that read like power and contrivance. She had a small folder in hand. "These designs are derivatives," she said, voice smooth and cruel. "The public deserves truth." Her words were a blade shortened into headline form. Cameras pivoted, whispers thickened. Claire felt the world tilt the way it did when someone pulled a tablecloth too fast and scattered plates of reputation across the floor. Sean, who had been seated in the third row, stood. He walked to the stage with a pace that felt like a sentence. He did not shout. He did not fight fire with circus. He moved like someone bearing the kind of authority that had to be used sparingly. He took a microphone from an assistant and addressed the room, his voice a low, controlled tide. "Tonight," he said, "is not the place for old vendettas dressed as morality. We will not interrupt a designer's work without basis. The accusations will be handled through appropriate channels. Now please, let the show proceed." The room murmured like a sea. Luna's mother smiled, as if the disruption itself were victory, but she had not calculated the depth of Sean's preparation. Backstage, Sean signaled to the technical crew. On a hunch, he had ensured a backup channel monitored company servers and security footage during the show, an insurance policy he hoped he would never need. He tapped a code, and in a move that would later be replayed across countless networks, the big screen behind the runway flickered, not with a promotional montage, but with a timeline of evidence Sean had assembled over the past weeks. There was footage of Javier Cruz, the lab technician, receiving an envelope. There were courier receipts matched to a day when Luna's mother had an appointment outside the city. There were server logs showing a ghost account logging in from a subnet linked to the private office of a certain trustee. Each file had a timestamp, a chain of custody note, and, most damagingly, a short clip of Luna's mother meeting with a courier outside a building with an anonymous exchange. The room was a living thing that inhaled. When the screen revealed the courier handing an envelope to the woman, the air stilled. Luna's mother's face changed from the practiced grace of a woman who could command crumbs of scandal to something close to raw fear. People shifted. Phones rose like a sea of small suns. Then the final image played, the envelope in question, its courier stamp, and a close-up of a receipt showing the same courier's account had been credited from funds traced to a shell organization connected to Luna's mother. It was not absolute legal proof, but it was damning in the court of public opinion and good enough to set red lights blinking on boards that had long been content to trade screws of influence. Luna, who had stood a moment ago with the confidence of a queen, now moved with the flailing grace of someone whose stage had slipped. "This is," she began, but the sentence found no purchase. People in the room murmured forgery and fabricated. The network cameras pivoted into a frenzy. Claire watched the screen with the slow, odd wonder of someone who had been building a house and suddenly found a neighbor pulling up the plans to reveal forgery. Her work had taken on an accusatory power. The room, sensing a new narrative, shifted allegiance the way weather changes. Security moved with practiced efficiency. An officer stepped toward Luna's mother, and she clutched at her envelope like someone trying to hide a secret behind a shawl. Sean held the microphone the way someone holds the end of a rope, steady, unbroken. "We will cooperate with authorities," he said softly. "Everyone implicated will be investigated, but for now, the show will continue." The head of the awards committee rose, voice tight and professional, and announced that the show should proceed as planned, and that an investigation would follow. Cameras switched to models again, but the audience now watched the runway with a new sense of attention. The drama was not in the clothes alone, but in the truth they carried. After the show, in the corridor outside the ballroom, reporters swarmed. Luna and her mother were escorted toward waiting security, who had a warrant in hand, a quiet orchestration of legal consequences guided by the preliminary evidence that Sean's team had delivered. Luna's mother showed a face like a woman who had been stripped of illusions. Luna's public composure cracked into a series of sharp breaths. For Claire, the vindication felt both public and offhand. She hugged Sean, but the gesture was small, her mind occupied with images of the twins sleeping and the way a mother learns to make safety with limited materials. Sean spoke to the press with the solemnity of someone who had just commanded a ship through a storm. He spoke of evidence and responsibility. He refused to weaponize the night into a spectacle beyond truth. He did, however, do something that had not been on any press release. He acknowledged the twins. "In my view," he said, eyes briefly finding Claire's, "family is not always defined by paperwork. There are ties that come from care, courage, and presence. Claire has shown both. The company stands with its designers who create with integrity. It was not a legal acceptance of paternity. It was something else, a public shelter. The language was chosen with care, and the world gathered it into headlines as both news and tenderness. The tabloid writers who had once cast claws over the twins' likeness now found themselves obliged to mention evidence, investigation, and the possibility of forgery. In the week that followed the awards, legal teams moved slowly but surely. Law enforcement detained a courier and traced funds. Subpoenas moved through channels. Luna's mother was questioned over a series of transactions that did not explain themselves easily. The paternity rumors, once a forest fire, lost oxygen. The focus returned to labor and process. Claire's professional world shifted as well. Buyers who had been curious now reached out with real interest. An editor who had once set a cautionary eyebrow now requested an interview to discuss process and the way the brand could be renewed. Phoenix Rising, once threatened by internal sabotage, now stood on firmer ground. The board, chastened by the revelation of internal manipulation, moved to support the project and to formalize Claire's role. Sean, who had been careful not to remake her life with a sweep of his pen, did push for a practical change, a promotion that would give Claire oversight of the Phoenix Rising line as lead designer, subject to the company's governance, and with the appropriate team and budget to turn her sketches into a production line. It was a reasonable compromise, no transformation by fiat, but a real elevation that honored her talent and compensated for the injuries of the past months. Claire accepted the promotion with the kind of gravity she used when she sewed a final stitch. It would be real work, messy and bureaucratic and thrilling in ways that had nothing to do with tabloids. It meant meetings that stretched nights and decisions that would test her taste and her nerve. It meant, too, that her name would be in lights in a way that could be used against her again. But she had also learned how to build armor that fit like clothes. The trials were not over. There were depositions, signatures, and procedural delays. Luna's mother posted bail with an arrogance she could still afford and attempted to spin narratives through a limited cadre of allies. Yet the sun shifted, and light found the edges of truth. The preliminary lab confirmation that a sample had been tampered with, the courier's confession, provided police with grounds to press charges. A legal settlement moved like a glacier, but with a direction. The court of public will had already decided in Claire's favor. The court of law had started to agree. One afternoon, after a board meeting that required Claire to defend her vision and her team with more baring of teeth than she liked, she returned home to find an envelope, a small hand-delivered card with a simple message. It read, "We did not choose the easy thing, we chose the right thing." The handwriting was not Sean's, it had the light punctuation of someone who preferred to let their actions speak. Claire folded the card into her pocket and went to the twins' room. Kevin had a question that had been gathering like weather. "Will those people ever say sorry to us?" he asked, voice small. Claire sat on the floor and pulled them close. "Sometimes people don't say sorry because they're ashamed," she said. "But what matters is that the truth shows up, even if it takes time, and we will keep making things they can't take." She kissed their hair and felt the ordinary miracle of family. A small set of breaths, a couple of mouths, a dozen tiny decisions that built safety. As things settled, social life around the Torres group adjusted. The board was still cautious about Sean's personal involvement with an employee, a prudent line in corporate governance, and they asked for clear demarcations. Claire accepted the company's boundaries with the same pragmatic heart she used when choosing thread. The promotion came with committees and budget sign-offs and a publicity plan structured with care. It also came with the knowledge that the world could be complicated and that a family's social map could not be redrawn overnight. Sean began to move into a different mode. He was no longer only a protector in the abstract. He became an active part of Claire's life in ways that were tender and practical. He asked about the twins' school and arranged for a scholarship at a community arts program where Kevin and Jane could put their own drawings into a place that celebrated small making. He attended fittings discreetly, sometimes watching from a corner with the sort of pride one reserves for a debut. He did not insist on being a father in the legal sense, at least not yet. He insisted on being present, and over time, presence became a shape the twins recognized. The public asked questions that did not always align with what people live inside. They wanted a neat story told in the span of a TV segment. But lives were more like fabric. They required reinforcement, invisible stitches, and occasionally patient mending. Claire and Sean existed in that liminal space, one where practical decisions met the slow work of trust. When Sean proposed, it was not a replay of the next day event that had started all of this. That moment had already been made. This proposal came after the awards, after promotion letters, after court filings and the sound of a city deciding it had better things to gossip about. It was not staged. It was a private thing that echoed in a public life. They were at Sean's family home, simple, private, surrounded by trees and the normal hush of suburban things. The twins were at a friend's house for a sleepover. Claire had wanted the reprieve in the mundane. It felt like an act of reclaiming evenings. Sean and she walked the backyard, where late light filtered through leaves like small coins. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said, hands shoved in pockets like a man half shy about tenderness. He had a small box again, but this time they both laughed at the absurd repetition of ritual. Claire looked at him. She measured the man she had first met at a rain-slicked curb, and the man who had chosen to be part of her life in ways that required steadiness. The city had tried to make a story from a single night, and they had both survived the way a seam survives a tug because it is well sewn. "I can't do the grand answer," she said. "Not for the public, not for a headline, but I can give you—" She reached for the language she had learned. "My life, the part that makes me who I am." Sean opened the box. Inside was not a ring meant to compress her life into a symbol, but a small band, unpretentious and rounded. "I don't want to buy your silence," he said. "I want to promise presence. Legal things will follow the right channels. I can't write the future, Claire. I can offer my name, my house, my time, my resources, and, if you'll have me, my family." She thought of Kevin asking if he was their dad, and the way Sean had answered with presence, not paperwork. She thought of the watch he had once offered, and of the way he had used power to build a shield rather than a cage. "Yes," she said, and they both laughed, a short, relieved sound. They held a small ceremony months later, a gathering in which the twins took center stage. It was not an extravagant affair. It was a clearing in which the small decisions of their lives were recognized. Friends from the studio stood near, an editor who had reluctantly become an ally, the investigator who had followed paper trails without applause. Ethan came, with a look that was part genuine affection and part respect. He gave Claire a small nod at the reception that said something like peace. Luna and her mother faced the consequences of their choices. Luna, who had once believed in the seamless privilege of social ownership, found herself publicly contrite in a tone that suggested survival rather than real repentance. Her mother, who had wielded power like a cutting instrument, negotiated a plea and retreated into the old money shadows she had known. Legal filings and settlements mitigated public spectacle, but the record remained. Manipulative acts unmasked, consequences arranged. At the company, Phoenix Rising moved from runway to retail, carried by a team that had been forged in the pressure of scrutiny. Claire led with a blend of quiet insistence and a fastidious concern for craft. She took meetings where she spoke about fabrics and the dignity of production, and occasionally argued about seam allowances with a moral intensity. The product performed not because of scandal, but because of quality. The twins thrived in ways that made Claire's chest a soft ache of gratitude. Kevin's drawings moved from private scribbles into school projects, and Jane's love for stitches and small things found an outlet in a youth sewing circle Sean helped sponsor. They learned a new vocabulary for their lives, words like visibility and boundaries and consent, and they learned the power of being seen for who they were. They also learned that family is made up of many gestures: guardianship paperwork in a lawyer's office, late-night stories, small gifts hidden in lunchboxes, a parent who shows up to school plays, and one who examines fabric labels with fierce pride. There were quiet evenings, ones that had nothing to do with headlines, where Claire sat at a kitchen table with the twins and watched them fold paper boats for a storm that would not come. Sean would bring dinner, place a plate on the table, and watch the scene with an expression that was both tender and slightly bewildered by the ordinariness of it all. These were the moments where the action of the past year settled into a rhythm that didn't require defense. "You ever think about how you almost kept walking that night?" Kevin asked once, drawing lighthouse shapes into his napkin with a pen. Claire smiled. "Sometimes," she said, "but there was no walking. There was only doing what needed to be done." "Good," Kevin said, solemn as a child can be, "because you would have missed the best parts." "Yes," Claire answered, because it was true. She had missed sleep and a quiet kitchen, and the way the city smells like rain and bread at 4 in the morning. But she had also gained a life that fit more fully into the shape she wanted to draw. In a final public clearing, Sean made a point of acknowledging Claire and the twins in a philanthropic announcement months after the awards. He spoke about a foundation for young creatives in underserved communities and named it in honor of mentors who saw potential rather than rumor. He made no grand claims about destiny. He made an actionable promise and a budget that could not be easily reversed. The media called it a move of generosity. Claire called it a ladder for other people. For the twins, it was proof that power could be used to build rather than to crush. The villains faded into the background of the city's social theater. Their names would remain in court documents and cautionary notes for a time. Claire's name moved forward as an author of work rather than as the subject of gossip. She kept sewing, kept teaching the twins how to measure and how to trust their hands, and she kept making room for grace. On a morning months after the awards, Claire walked into the studio and felt the air hold like a lung. The Phoenix Rising line had been greenlit for a modest run. A buyer called, another magazine requested a profile, and a shop on the Lower East Side placed a small order: simple victories. She walked to her drafting table and sat, the sun folding across the pages with the kind of light that made patterns readable. A small hand slipped into hers, Sean's, his fingers finding the one that always had ink stains on it. "Ready?" he asked, as if the question contained both a practical meeting and an invitation to a life they were still discovering. She smiled, the kind that had been tempered by fire and deliberation. "Always," she said. They were a family that night because they had navigated danger, rumor, and sabotage and chosen to build something together. There was no full erasure of the past. Legal processes had run their course, and reputations had been repaired by the slow accumulation of proof rather than by the speed of headlines. But that was how real repair worked. It took stitches and patience, and sometimes the temperate courage to keep showing up. At the end of the day, Claire found herself tucking the twins into bed, their small hands trusting her fingers the way fabric trusts thread. Kevin pressed a drawing into her palm. "For the best designer," he said solemnly. Claire smoothed the paper and held it to her chest. Outside, the city moved on, lights winking like small promises. Inside, in the two-bedroom apartment that had been their workshop and their shelter, she felt the particular satisfaction of someone who had sewn together something durable from fragments. When the world asked for the tidy story, she could give it a headline. She had saved a billionaire's life. The next day he had proposed in a way that changed everything. But the truth she lived inside was more complex and far kinder. She had acted to protect two small lives, stepped into a world that nearly crushed her, and, by the slow work of evidence, craft, and stubborn love, built a life where the twins could draw and breathe and grow. If you loved Claire's fight and the way courage rewrites fate, subscribe for more stories of resilience, craft, and second chances.